So once again, do your best to bring into your mind the aspiration to be of benefit to all living beings, or at least to as many beings as possible. And the best thing we can do for others and for ourselves is to work for enlightenment, create the causes to become fully enlightened, fully awakened, a Buddha. So if you're comfortable with that idea, then you can think that's your reason, your motivation for listening. May this class, this talk, help you get closer to enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. If you're not so familiar with and comfortable with the idea of attaining enlightenment, then bring into your mind whatever altruistic attitude you are comfortable with. For example, just thinking, may this talk be beneficial for me and for others and for the world. So there were a number of questions sent to me, so I'll start by providing answers to those. So one question is, are mental afflictions wrong conceptions because they are impermanent and we see them as permanent? No, that's not the reason. Although it's true that they are impermanent, and if we see them as permanent, that is not correct. So that's actually another wrong conception. But that's not why afflictions are wrong conceptions. The reason that afflictions are wrong conceptions is because they are wrong about their object. I gave the example of Joe. If we're angry at Joe, I mean, Joe's just a person, a sentient being with a body and mind, and he's not really good or bad from his own side. But if we have anger, hatred towards him, then the way he appears to us is bad. Joe the jerk, Joe the idiot, despicable Joe, something like that. You know, we have this image of him as being 100% bad. And we're engaging with him in that way. So that's why it's wrong. That's why wrong conceptions are wrong, is because they're not seeing things accurately. They're not seeing things as they are. They see things incorrectly. And an example of another affliction, attachment. So when we have attachment, desire, craving towards a person or towards an object, it's just an object, a collection of parts, nothing really good or bad there. But in our mind, the way the object appears is 100% wonderful. And I want it, I need it, it will bring me happiness. And maybe even I can't be happy without it. Yeah, so our mind exaggerates and blows up the good qualities of the object and makes it seem more than it really is. And then we want it, we grasp for it. So this isn't always easy to see. We have to really watch our mind and check how things appear to our mind to be able to recognize this. But this is the problem with afflictive emotions, is their misunderstanding, seeing objects in an incorrect way. So another question, what did the police chief want after making all of you wait for 4 hours? I was kind of waiting for someone to ask that. I didn't tell the punchline. I don't remember clearly what happened. All I can remember was we went into his office and he was sitting there at his big desk with his uniform and looking very official. And he asked some questions. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was standing right in front of him and we were kind of around. And so Rinpoche answered the questions. I don't remember what the questions were. My guess is he's just saying, what are you guys doing? Why are you staying in the country so long? Something like that. So Rinpoche gave answers like, we are trying to practice Dharma and we are trying to live a good life. Something like that. I don't know. That's my guess. But anyway, we didn't last very long, and then he seemed to be satisfied, and he said, okay, you can go. Yeah, and then we were given visas after that for a while, until he was replaced by somebody else. And the next person wasn't a Buddhist, wasn't so sympathetic for us. So we had to leave the country for 6 months, and the whole group of us went to Dharamsala. I think Venerable Children was with us at that time, but she wasn't yet Venerable Children. She was still cherry green. And that's the time when she was sick with hepatitis. She probably told that story. Yeah, so she was in that big group of people going overland over India in the hottest time of the year. Anyway, but that was what happened with the police chief. I sometimes wondered if it was just a test. Maybe I'm putting too much on it, but maybe he was testing us, kind of deliberately making us wait and just see how we would behave. Would we behave like good Buddhists, or be patient, or would we get upset and freak out? And I don't know. Who knows what was going on there? Okay, the next question. The brain is an organ. When we have a thought, it is a firing of neurons. This brain activity can be seen on a PET scan. But I should still consider the organ, the brain, and the activity noted during thought, or the brain activity through the reaction from other senses, sight, smell, and sound, as still being a part of the brain, and that the mind is still something else or another thing. Is this thought process something that plagues Westerners studying the Dharma? Yeah, it probably does. It never bothered me because I never studied the brain. I didn't have that education. So I kind of went into Buddhism pretty early on, and I just, accepted the Buddhist explanation of the mind. But yeah, there probably are Westerners who have been educated with that model of the brain being the source of all our thoughts and experiences. Yeah, so the Buddhist model is quite different. So my understanding is there have been discussions between the Dalai Lama and other Buddhists and Western scientists. This has been going on for more than 30 years. They have an organization called, is it Mind Life or Mind Science? Mind and Life. Yeah, is it Mind and Life Conference? Mind and Life Conferences? Yeah. And so, so the Buddhists and the scientists get together and discuss things like this. And I don't know what conclusions they've come to about the brain. I do remember hearing His Holiness say, after listening to the scientists, that when it comes to our more gross level of experiences, like our senses, that they do depend on the brain. But Buddhism talks about, and I haven't really talked about this yet, more subtle levels of the mind that do not depend on the brain. Because, for example, Buddhism says that, when our body dies and our brain stops functioning, there is this subtle level of the mind that continues to exist, and that is what goes to the next life and takes rebirth in a new body. So His Holiness says that doesn't depend on the brain. That is able to exist independent of the brain. Yeah, it's interesting to look into near-death experiences, because people have these experiences where their body and even their brain temporarily stop functioning, and yet their mind continues. They continue having experiences, conscious experiences, and quite extraordinary experiences during this seemingly dead state. And a lot of material has been published on this, a lot of books, a lot of research has been done as well. And so that's challenging, if you believe that the brain is the source of all conscious experiences, then how is it possible for somebody to have conscious experiences even when the brain isn't functioning? And there's a book We have it here in the library. I really recommend it. It's called Proof of Heaven. And the author is Ibn Alexander. He's a doctor, a neurosurgeon, in fact. So he knows very much about the brain. He's operated on brains. He knows all the different parts of the brain and how they function and so on. And in 2008, he suddenly became extremely ill, went into a coma, and was in a coma for about a week. And they were scrambling to figure out what happened to him. And I think it was some kind of bacteria, E. coli, bacterial meningitis, something extremely rare. And they also didn't understand how it got into his brain, but it was in his brain and it was destroying his brain. And the doctors were doing everything they could to, save his life, but they weren't successful. And after, 4 or 5 days, his brain was getting more and more damaged. And they said, even if he does survive, he'll be in a vegetative state for the rest of his life. And so they were getting ready to pull the plug, give up on him. And then he came out of his coma suddenly, full of life, full of energy. And during the time he was in this coma, he had these extraordinary experiences. I'm not going to tell you. You read the book. It's really amazing. And then several years after he, came out of the coma, he decided to write about his experiences because he really wanted to share them with others. And it totally transformed him. And he went through all the possible explanations, knowing what he does about the brain and also knowing what was happening with his brain, because all the medical records were there during that week that he was in the hospital and what was happening with his brain. And he said he could not find any possible explanation for his experiences based on the brain and based on what was happening with his brain. So he talks about that in the book, because he says, some scientists, when they hear about near-death experiences, they say, oh, well, this is just some kind of fantasy created by the brain. But he says that doesn't make any sense. It's not possible for that to happen, given especially the state of his brain. So that could be helpful to open the mind up to the idea. And he says he's totally convinced that there is consciousness beyond the brain, beyond this life. And being a Christian, he interpreted his experiences from that point of view. So like the title of the book, Proof of Heaven. For him, that was proof of heaven, proof of God. A Buddhist who went through such experiences would probably explain it differently, that this is proof of an afterlife and a proof of other realms and other kinds of beings. And actually, one interesting thing in the book, he was, visiting this other realm and having an extraordinarily beautiful place and having these kind of interactions with this being, not something visible or, having shape or form, but more like a presence that he would feel this kind of mind-to-mind connection with. But, could be God. But he said the word that kept coming in his mind was Om. That's how he described this being, was Om. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, because in Buddhism, that's, the syllable that comes at the beginning of most of our mantras. And it's said to be, it represents enlightenment, enlightened body, speech, and mind. And I know Om also exists in Hinduism. I don't know what significance it has in Hinduism, but I just thought, well, that's really interesting. Where did he go? Anyway, it's an interesting book. There are others as well where people describe near-death experiences, but this one is particularly valuable because he himself is a neurosurgeon, a neuroscientist. He knows all about the brain, and so he can explain his experiences in terms of the brain and how there's just no way his brain could have come up with these experiences. So I think there's a lot of room for exploration in this whole mind-brain connection. Definitely there is a connection between the mind and the brain, but how, I think they're still exploring that. Nicole, I don't know, do you know anything about that? No. Yeah. But even from the Buddhist point of view, I think there's things to be explored, because some of the people who have near-death experiences will find themselves out of their body and in the same room where their body is, like in the hospital. Maybe they're up on the ceiling or they're over in the corner, and they're observing what's going on. And afterwards they can say what the doctors were doing, what the nurses were doing, what they were saying, and it can be verified. You know, they really did perceive what was going on in the room while their body was lying there dead, you know, not showing any sign of life. So then, how do we explain that? Because we say that perceptions, you know, seeing and hearing and so forth, depend on our body and depend on our sense powers. So how did this person see things and hear things? Although in Tantra, I think we find the best explanation of the mind-body connection in Tantra, because there we find an explanation of how the mind is always together with subtle energy winds, which are a kind of form, and it travels all through the body on these subtle energy channels. So the mind is actually everywhere in the body. And also they do say, this isn't always, you know, mentioned, but I've heard it a number of times, that we have a subtle body, a dream body, and when we dream, I don't know if this always happens, but it can happen, this subtle body will actually go out of our physical body and move around, travel around while we're sleeping. So our body is lying there on the bed and our subtle body goes out. So that could be, and the subtle body can have perceptions. Different kind of perceptions than the ones we have with our physical eyes and ears and so forth. So that could be an explanation of that type of experience, that it's a subtle body leaving the gross physical body and then just hanging around in the hospital room and watching what's going on. Yeah, anyway, lots of interesting things. Okay, another question. When there's restlessness in the mind, what is the mind looking for or needing? So I think that's something you have to explore yourself, because each of us has our own experiences, and I think we all do experience restlessness sometimes, but why we experience restlessness, that would be an individual thing. So if you do find your mind being restless, you could just try to take a step back from that and ask, what's this all about? Why am I restless? What do I want? What do I need? What am I looking for? And just see what comes up in response to that. So only you can know that. Nobody can tell you that. You have to explore that yourself. And if no answer comes up, don't give up. Try again. Keep trying. And eventually, you might find the answer. But try not to be pushy about it. You know, just be friendly. And what's going on, mind? Why are you restless? What do you want? What do you need? Another question. How to know if what is in the mind is a vision of the past or a fantasy? I'm not sure what they mean by vision of the past. I mean, if it's memory from this life, then I think that's probably something you can verify yourself. You know, was I really in that place and did I really do that thing? But it's also possible the person means past life. And people do sometimes have past life memories. And they might wonder, is this really a past life memory, or is it just a fantasy that my mind is creating? And it's difficult to know for sure. I mean, I've had a number of experiences like that, and I don't know for sure, because I wasn't somebody famous that I can go and look up information about, you know. I mean, most people who lived in the past didn't have biographies written about themselves, so you wouldn't be able to find, you know, on Google, Wikipedia about that person. And maybe you can't even remember the name of that person. You just have these memories, but you don't remember the name. So it's difficult to know for sure. It could be past life memories, it could be fantasies. But I don't think it helps to worry about that and get all kind of, I want to find out. instead, I think it might be more useful to just ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Is there something I can learn from this vision or memory, whatever it is, that can help me live a better life and be a better person? That would be my recommendation. Okay, next question. During meditation, it seems there are 3 minds. One observing, one questioning, one answering. Is this real or imaginary? Yeah, I don't think it is the case that we have 3 different minds, because I already explained that our mind is always changing. Every moment we have different experiences arising and passing, arising and passing. Yeah, so in one moment there might be a question coming up, and the next moment an answer coming up. The next moment just observing happening. That this is all the same mind. They're just different experiences happening within the same stream of mind, the mental continuum. And there was a note here. From our discussion, people are still not clear about the difference between perception and conception, probably because they happen so fast when afflictions arise. I mean, I think it can be difficult to actually see and observe our own mind and be able to, maybe sometimes we can recognize this is a perception or this is a conception, but I think it's true that in our ordinary perception, our ordinary experiences, when we have our eyes open and we're active, doing things, the mind does change very quickly back and forth between perceptions and conceptions, too fast for us to notice. You'd have to have this incredible mindfulness, or maybe even be an Arya being, to be able to notice every single instance of mind and be able to recognize which one is a perception and which one is a conception. But on the other hand, we can, experiment on our own. And for example, if we close our eyes and then bring to mind a person or a place or an object, and have at that time, we don't have a perception of it because it's not there in front of us. So we just have a mental image of it. So just let yourself stay with that experience for a while and, understand that is a conception, not a perception. So anytime we are remembering or conjuring up, bringing to mind an object that we may have seen before, that is always a conception. And anytime we're thinking, we're having thoughts, those are conceptions, not perceptions. So perceptions are just when our senses are awake and active, seeing things, hearing things, and so on. As described in these texts, those are experiences where our mind is directly perceiving, directly contacting objects, rather than seeing or perceiving or experiencing just images, mental images of the objects. So I think we just have to get familiar with our mind and observe our experience, and then try to pay more attention to those different types of experiences and get to know them better. So then one other thing, this is just from me, but yesterday we were having a discussion about what kind of mind it is. Oh, Venerable Losang's not here. What kind of mind that it is that knows abstract composites, like a person, time, place, like an area. So these are things that are impermanent phenomena, but they are neither form, they're not physical matter, and they're also not consciousness. So it's this third type of impermanent phenomena that's neither form nor consciousness. So we were discussing how are those experienced, how are those perceived, and one idea was that they can be perceived directly. We can see a person, for example. That was your what you said. And then Venerable Losang said, but a person is just imputed to their body and the mind. So how can we see that? How can we see something that is just imputed? Although afterwards I was thinking, but according to Prasangika, everything is imputed. And so if you say, well, we cannot perceive something that's imputed, that means we wouldn't be able to perceive anything. We wouldn't be able to have any sense perceptions. But anyway, let me just go on. So I read in volume 2, the foundation of, what is it? I can never remember the name. Foundation of Buddhist Practice. It's easier to remember volume 1, volume 2, and so on. On page 19 of that, I came across this sentence that says, according to Sautrantikas, from the viewpoint of direct perceivers, all functioning things are evident phenomena, because under the right conditions, they can be perceived by our direct perceivers. So since that says all functioning things, and all functioning things means all impermanent phenomena, so that means all three types of impermanent phenomena: form, consciousness, and abstract composites. So that seems to be saying that, according to Sautrantika anyway, even abstract composites, under the right conditions, can be perceived. So what does it mean, under the right conditions? Maybe it's like with the fire. You know, fire is something that can be perceived as long as it's visible and not hidden inside of a furnace, inside of a house. But yeah, with something like a person or with time, how do we perceive a person or a time? Unless it's like what I read this morning from Elizabeth Napper, that when we get really familiar with a particular person, like our father, then our eye consciousness is able to know he's a man, he's my father, without actually giving those labels. But our eye consciousness can still know man and father, which means a person. He's a person. Venerable Tsipul, did you want to add something?
Thinking along the same lines, that if a person can come to know their father as father, not by labeling, but just from familiarity, then it seems like you could do that with many impermanent phenomena.
So that's still something to think about and explore. Okay, so let's continue with going through the 7 kinds of awareness. We've only done 2 so far, so well, some of them don't take very long. So number 3 is called subsequent cognizers. So this is slide number 10 in my list. So subsequent cognizers, these are minds that realize an object that was previously realized by a valid cognizer. So they come after a valid cognizer. So after having a valid cognizer, a valid experience of an object, then after that, other minds experiencing the same object are called subsequent. So they could arise in the very next moment. For example, after perceiving a red rose with valid direct perception, that the first moment is valid because it's new and fresh, but the second moment, third moment, fourth moment, and so on are no longer valid because they're not new anymore. They're like the cars of the choo-choo train, being pulled along by the engine. So they're no longer valid, but they're still correct. They do perceive the object correctly, but they just lack the newness. So those are called subsequent cognizers. And they do realize their object. So they are correct, and they have, this certainty about the object, what the object is, how it is. But they are not, and they are infallible. Okay, so they are infallible, which means, they're correct, and they can lead to certainty afterwards. But because they are not new, they are not valid. So subsequent cognizers can be perceptions. Example, the second moment of an eye consciousness correctly seeing yellow. Second moment, third moment, and so on. So those would be subsequent cognizers that are perceptions. And they can also be conceptions. So examples of conceptions that are subsequent cognizers would be, after seeing yellow, having a valid direct perception of yellow, if later you think about it, like maybe you went to visit somebody's house and it was painted yellow, and you thought that was a really nice color yellow, and maybe I'll paint my house that color or something like that. So you're thinking about the yellow that you saw. That would also be a subsequent cognizer, but a conceptual one, because it's thinking rather than directly perceiving. Another example is a later moment of realizing impermanence or emptiness after having a valid inference. So a person, after studying and developing a correct understanding of impermanence or emptiness, and then having an actual realization, an inferential realization, a conceptual realization of that object, the first moment is valid because it's new and fresh. And then the second moment, if they continue sitting there meditating, then the second, third, and fourth moments will be subsequent cognizers, but conceptual ones. And also even the next day, if next day they remember the realization they had the day before, that would still be a conceptual subsequent cognizer. Yeah, and again, this thing about being new, having to be new in order to be a valid cognizer, this is only some schools who say that. The Sutrantika, the Sutra school, the Chittamatra, the mind-only school. And also I checked during the lunch break, the Madhyamika Svatantrika school. So it's the other Madhyamikas, not the Prasangikas, the Svatantrikas. So those three schools all say that it's only the first moment that is a valid cognizer, but Madhyamika Prasangika is an exception. They disagree, so they say. So according to Madhyamika Prasangika, subsequent cognizers, they still use the term subsequent cognizers, but they say subsequent cognizers are also valid. They don't require a valid cognizer to be new. So they're more open, they're more accepting. So then the next slide, the importance of inferential and subsequent cognizers in our Dharma practice, sort of bringing it to a practical level, how these are helpful for us in our Dharma practice. So a big part of Dharma practice is working on our mind. In fact, that's the main thing about Dharma, is working on our mind to bring about a transformation of our mind and gradually reducing and eventually removing all the afflictive emotions, all the mistaken conceptions, the wrong consciousnesses in our mind, because those are the cause of suffering, all our suffering. Our whole situation being in samsara, dying and being reborn and having all the problems that we have, it's all because of these wrong conceptions in our mind. And so they need to be gotten rid of, we need to remove them. And we also need to cultivate positive, virtuous, correct, beneficial states of mind. To be able to do this, we need inference to be able to understand hidden objects like impermanence and emptiness. So impermanence and emptiness are two very, very important objects that we need to understand. And they're hidden objects. They're not visible. They're not accessible to our five senses. So to know them, to understand them, to realize them, we need to use our conceptual mind and eventually reach inferential realization, have an inferential realization of these. And I think my experience, I still find emptiness quite challenging, and I'm nowhere near realizing it. But I find impermanence easier to understand and very practical. For example, when we have disturbing emotions, we can remind ourselves that they are impermanent. They come and go in our mind. And we can see that for ourselves. We can, realize that there are moments when we have that affliction, like anger. There's moments when there's anger present in our mind, or attachment, or whatever it may be. But we can also think back and remember times when we didn't have that emotion in our mind. Our mind wasn't plagued by that afflictive emotion. So from that we can see it's something that comes and goes, impermanent. And that itself helps. I find that really, really helpful. Just to realize, okay, right now there's this really nasty state of mind, but it's not going to be there forever. It's going to stop. It's going to go away. That kind of helps me to cool down and calm down. And we can also remind ourselves of the object towards whom or towards which we have the afflictions, the person or the object that we're angry at or we have attachment for. That's something impermanent too. It's changing moment by moment. It's not always going to be the same. Like if somebody's behaving in a way that's really irritating to you, well, they don't behave like that every minute, every second, 24 hours a day. So, yeah, this, irritating behavior is impermanent. And the person too is impermanent. And it could be helpful to imagine that person later in their life when they're elderly and maybe sick and maybe in pain and helpless, suffering. So if you imagine the person later in their life in that kind of condition, that could help you to not be so angry at them and make some space in your mind to have compassion for them. And same with objects of attachment. Right now that object may look really wonderful, really fantastic, but is it going to always look like that? Imagine how it's going to look later in time. If it's a person, how they're going to look when they're 80 years old, 90 years old. So that can help to decrease the attachment. And also, I am impermanent. Remember our own impermanent nature, that I'm not going to be around forever. I'm going to die one day. And like Shantideva says, I forget which chapter, 1 or 2, he says, leaving all, I will depart alone. But through not understanding this, I committed various kinds of evil for the sake of my friends and foes. So not thinking about impermanence, our own impermanence, and living our life as if we're going to be here forever, we can get so caught up in what's happening at the moment, so angry at people that we don't like, and so attached to other people and things that we want, and then possibly create karma, negative karma on the basis of that. But remember the impermanence of all of this, and I'm not going to be here forever, and they're not going to be here forever, and we're going to separate one day. So is it really important to get so caught up in these afflictive emotions? So that's really helpful for me, even though I don't have yet a realization of impermanence, but maybe I have a correct assumption. That's another of these states of mind we'll come to. And that can be very helpful for working on our mind. So anyway, we do need to understand and realize these hidden objects. And then once we have realized them, we need to retain those understandings and not forget them. So any insights we have, any realizations we have into these objects, we need to keep those alive and make our mind more and more familiar with them, both during meditation and during our daily life. And doing that involves subsequent cognizers. So subsequent cognizers are very useful for us, especially in our Dharma practice, in our analytical meditations and our practice in daily life, just to keep in mind that understanding that we had when we were meditating. So this is how our mind gets transformed, gradually our afflictions decrease, diminish, and our positive, virtuous states of mind increase more and more. Because that's also something we use subsequent cognizers. If we meditate on loving kindness, compassion, so we generate those experiences, and we want to try to keep those alive in our mind as much as we can. Those thoughts, those feelings of compassion and kindness. So this is subsequent cognizers, keeping them alive, familiarizing ourselves with them. So it's helpful, I think, to see these not as just these technical terms, but these are actually states of mind that we experience and use and are very useful for us. Okay, next is number 4 of the 7 types of knowing, called correctly assuming consciousness, or a simpler way is correct assumption. So this is a conception. It's always conceptual. It does know its object correctly, but it's not infallible. It's fallible. It's not very firm and stable, strong. It does not realize its object, enabling us to have absolute certainty about it. So it'll be easier if we look at some examples of this. So an example would be to think, everything is empty of inherent existence. Why do we say that? Why do we think that? Well, my teacher said so. Lama Tsongkhapa said so. Dalai Lama said so. Buddha said so. So just because we heard it and we don't reject it, we go along with it, we think, yeah, I think it's true. So we have a correct understanding. It's true that things are empty of inherent existence, but it's not based on a good reason. Other examples would be, believing in something like that, but for a wrong reason. For example, everything is empty of inherent existence because it exists. This table is empty of inherent existence because it exists. That's not a good reason. That's not a foolproof reason. You'd get smashed on the debating ground if you try to give that as a reason for why things are empty of inherent existence. And even if we have a good reason, a correct reason, like dependent arising, this table is empty of inherent existence because it's dependent arising, because it depends on other things, causes and conditions and parts and so on. So that's the correct reason. But if we haven't gone through the whole process of the logical process of checking out that correct reason, does it have the property of the subject? Does it have the forward privation? Does it have the reverse privation? And got to the point where, it actually, a light bulb goes off in our mind and we realize that, then it's still a correct assumption rather than an inferential realization. So these are correct, but they're somewhat flimsy and weak. If somebody were to come along and challenge us, we would have a hard time defending our position, and we might even, might even generate doubt if we're right. Because we haven't really gone through the whole process of investigating and realizing and being absolutely 100% sure of this idea or this fact. And I can't remember where I got this from, but the last bullet point, it may have been Geshe-ma Kelsang Wangmo, that most of our knowledge, even our birth date, is correctly assuming consciousness. So all of our knowledge, all the things we've learned from our teachers, most of it, we didn't investigate to see if it's true or not. We just went along. Yeah, it must be true because my teacher said so, and the textbook said so. The government says so. It must be true. Yeah. So if it is true, if they are actual facts, then it's correctly assuming consciousness. If what we were told was not true, if it was false information, disinformation, fake news, I don't know, There's a lot of that going around these days, and people believing in it. So people who subscribe to QAnon and believe what is said on QAnon, then that wouldn't be correctly assuming consciousness. That's probably a wrong conception, wrong consciousness. And so to be correctly assuming consciousness, it does have to be correct. Okay, the next one, number 5. This is probably something we're very familiar with. Awareness is, it's got a really long name. This is a very precise translation of the Tibetan. Awareness is to which an object appears but is not ascertained. The short version is inattentive perception, which is more of a description rather than a precise translation, but it's a lot easier to manage. Inattentive perception. So these are perceptions. They're not conceptions. They're perceptions, they're actually direct perceptions. So that means they are correct. Our mind isn't fully attentive while they're happening, and so we don't fully realize what's going on. So an example would be if you're watching a movie and you're really engrossed in the movie, and somebody says, lunch is ready. So you do have an ear consciousness, a hearing consciousness, hearing that sound, hearing that voice, but you don't fully realize what was said because you weren't paying full attention. So like I said, sometimes during teachings this can happen. We're thinking about something else or reading something else on our computer and don't really hear what was said. But it could also happen the other way. If we are fully focused on listening to something, and at the same time we have our eyes open looking at something, but our eye consciousness might be inattentive. We're not fully aware of what we're seeing. Can anyone think of an example of that?
An example of that could be if you're driving and talking on the phone and engrossed in that conversation, then you may not see the person at the crosswalk, or you may see them, but not really see them, and you might not stop for them.
Yeah, that's a good example, and it does happen, I guess, and that creates accidents. Yeah, that's why we're not supposed to. It's illegal, isn't it? I know in some countries, like in Israel, people have their phone connected to their radio and a little microphone, so they can be still driving and not have to hold the phone, and they can just be talking and listening. But yeah, if you get really engrossed in your conversation, or if somebody gives you some news that's kind of really startling, then your attention is focused on that, and you may not be fully attentive to things that you're seeing. Yeah, and it can be dangerous. So there's a term here, and it's used in other contexts as well, realize. So that's sometimes happens. We have a mental state, an experience, and sometimes it realizes its object and sometimes it doesn't. So in the case of this type of mind, an inattentive perception, it doesn't realize the object. The meaning of realize, I didn't put it down here, but I'll read it out. When a mind realizes its object, it means that later one is able to have a kind of a correct memory of the object. You remember very clearly, very correctly, very precisely what you saw, what you heard, and so on. So that's what happens when we realize an object. Afterwards, we have very clear memory, correct memory of what we perceived. Another aspect of realize is that it eliminates superimpositions or misconceptions about it. So for example, if you saw an object but you weren't quite sure what color it was, if you're on the witness stand in the trial and you're asked, what color was that car that you saw? And you're like, I'm not sure, maybe it was green or maybe it was blue. So that means you didn't realize the color of the car because you're not certain later about it. If you realized it, then you would say definitely 100% it was green. I know it was green. It was a 1995 Buick or something like that. People sometimes are so attentive, you know, they can really see all these details and remember that afterwards. Maybe people who are into cars and really interested in different kinds of cars. So other people can't be bothered and don't remember such details. So that's what it means to realize. If you realize an object, you're sure about it, and later you can report back, it was this, it was like that, and I'm sure about it, 100%. And you are correct. You didn't have some mistake about what you saw. So that's what happens when we realize an object. So in this case, it's pretty obvious that that isn't the case when we have an inattentive perception. Afterwards, if somebody asks, what did she say? What was that color? And we can't remember, then that means we didn't realize it. So realize means later you can remember the object correctly and with certainty. But still, this type of mind is said to be non-mistaken. Even though it doesn't realize the object, it's still said to be non-mistaken to the appearing object. For example, the sound of the voice. You did hear a voice. You are sure of that. There was somebody talking, but you just can't remember what they said. You did see a car, but you just can't remember what kind it was and what color it was. So there's some aspect of the experience that is, experienced correctly, but other aspects of it that are not. And so we were talking about these kind of mental direct perceivers that are really short. They just like flash between a sense perceiver and a conception thinking about it. Remember that one? That just a very brief moment that we can't be aware of. So those are examples of this kind of mind. They're inattentive perceptions. We can't remember them afterwards. Another thing, Lama Tsongkhapa says that it's possible for us to have all 5 sense perceptions at the same time. We talked about that this morning. We can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch all at the same time. But, he says, only one of those will actually realize its object, and the other 4 are inattentive perceptions. So we can't have 5 fully attentive perceptions at the same time. Only one fully attentive at a time. But I still think the mind can switch back and forth. So maybe in moment A, your visual perception is more attentive, and maybe moment B, the hearing one is more attentive, and moment C, the smell one. So if there's a sequence of experiencing these objects, then they could kind of go in and out of being attentive and inattentive. That's just my guess, but that's why when you're sitting in a movie theater, you probably can afterwards remember a lot of details about that whole thing. Not just the movie, but the sounds and the smells and the tastes, because you probably did have at least some attentive perceptions of those various objects. Okay, number 6, we're getting close. Doubt. The sixth one is doubt. And doubt is always conceptual. And it's uncertain, wavering between 2 alternatives, like Venerable Jigme gave a very good display of doubt in her BBC the other day. Maybe this, maybe that, I don't know. And so it's a fallible mind, not an infallible one, and doesn't realize its object. So there are 3 types of doubt, 3 kind of variations. The first one, doubt that tends towards the fact. For example, if you're trying to figure out if sound is permanent or impermanent, according to Buddhism, it's impermanent. So if you're leaning in that direction, yeah, it's probably impermanent. Probably what the Buddha said and the teachers say. Sound probably is impermanent. You're still not 100% sure, but you're leaning in that direction. The second is doubt not tending towards the fact. And that would be thinking, yeah, they say it's impermanent, but probably not. It's probably permanent. So leaning in the opposite direction, away from the truth, the fact. And then there's equal doubt, where you're kind of wavering back and forth. Yeah, maybe it's impermanent, maybe it's permanent, I don't know. So the first type of doubt is okay. In fact, it's helpful. The Dalai Lama says often that we should have doubt. We shouldn't just immediately believe what we are taught by the Buddha or by any of our teachers. We should be skeptical, question, investigate. So it's good to have that kind of doubt. The second kind of doubt is somewhat dangerous because it can lead to a wrong view. If we keep going in that direction, it's probably permanent. And eventually we'll think, definitely, I'm sure it's permanent. Just like this non-Buddhist school says, the Vedas are permanent, definitely. So then we can get stuck in a wrong view. And even equal doubt isn't ideal, because this can be kind of paralyzing or immobilizing. It's like if you're driving and you come to I don't know what they're called here, but in some countries they're called a T-junction. You have these two roads going off, and you're just not sure which road you should take. And if you end up just sitting there for hours, yeah, I should go that. No, I should do that one. No, I should. So you can get really stuck and not move forward. So that can happen mentally as well. In our practice, in our Dharma study, in our Dharma practice, if we get stuck in this kind of equal doubt and don't try to resolve it, then it's difficult to move forward and have the energy to continue practicing. So if we do have doubt, it's fine, it's okay, but we should at least try to resolve it, try to find out more information, talk to teachers, talk to more knowledgeable and senior students. Think about it yourself, really investigate, and try to come to a resolution of it. Okay, last one, wrong consciousness. So we've already talked about this quite a bit. So this is a mind that's mistaken to its object of engagement, which is the actual object that the mind is engaged in. And it can be a conception, for example, believing that sound is permanent. So if you go to that point of deciding, yes, I really think sound is permanent, and you hold on to that, strongly, that is a wrong consciousness, because sound is not permanent. It's impermanent. It's changing all the time. But that would be a conceptual wrong consciousness. Another example is if you believe there is an inherently existing I very firmly. I really think I inherently exist. I'm sure of it. No doubt. Definitely. So that again is a conception, a conceptual wrong consciousness. And other examples that are maybe more the kind of things we might encounter. Sometimes people get this idea that they're somebody that they're not. Like some people think they're Maitreya Buddha. It's probably maybe some mental illness. What do they call that? When people have these delusions of thinking that they're... Delusions of grandeur. Yeah. And I was thinking about one time when I was in Dharamsala, I met this nun from England, and she wanted to talk to me, so we got together, and then she told me this story where she said, what I can remember of it was, she was convinced that she was the only person who could save Tibet from the Chinese communists. And she had to get to the Dalai Lama and talk to the Dalai Lama. But all these people, all his attendants and secretaries and so on, were blocking her from that. And she even said they were tapping her phone and they were spying on her, and this whole story. And it's interesting because she had this very nice appearance. You know, she looked very nice and very intelligent and very together. But when she opened her mouth and started talking, it was like, I think this is wrong consciousness, wrong conception. But she seemed to be 100% convinced, 100% believing in these ideas. Anyway, so there are people who have such experiences, and it's quite sad. They might end up in a mental hospital. That did happen. This one man he was the husband of one of my friends, and he went into retreat for a while and then came out declaring that he was Maitreya. And he seemed to really believe that he was Maitreya Buddha. And that was actually many years ago. That was when I first went to Dharamsala in 1973. And the last I heard, he's still in a mental hospital and he'll never recover from that. So I don't know what happened. And very sad.
Your first example of the woman that was so paranoid, you know, being a paranoid schizophrenic is very treatable. Many of these are very treatable if you get the right medicine and you get it early on. I had many patients I worked with that were married, had kids, had a good profession, and without their medications, their thinking would be exactly like that. But with medication, they were fine.
But they also have to acknowledge that
That's
there's
the
a
hard
problem
part.
there. Yeah. I had the
that's why
feeling that
yeah.
if anyone tried to talk to her
Mm.
and say, well, maybe it's not quite like that,
Yeah.
she would probably deny it.
Yeah.
And maybe she'd even see you as another person who's blocking
Yeah.
her from her
Yeah.
mission to save Tibet.
Yep.
So
You have to get it early when it
Yeah.
first starts coming, and then you can do something.
So anyway, lots of wrong conceptions can happen, and we have them too. Our afflictive emotions, when they come up really strong and we get caught up in them and follow them, then we're in a wrong consciousness, a wrong state of mind. And there's also perceptions. We've talked lots about that. Here's a few new examples. Hearing an echo of your own voice as another person's voice. That's actually one that comes up in the teachings. You know, you're in this big cave or big empty building and you talk, and then this echo comes and it really can sound like another person talking. And if you believe in that, I guess even the perception of it, even if you don't have the conceptual mind believing in it, but just the perception, it does sound as if it's somebody else talking rather than yourself. And another example is a dream mind believing, I misspelled believing, another boo-boo there. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. A dream mind believing a dream tiger to be a real tiger. And that's something else that happens to us if we're dreaming and things that we see seem real. And if it's something scary, like a tiger chasing you, we can be really terrified. If it's something wonderful and beautiful, then we can be really happy and excited. So our dream mind does tend to believe the things that we perceive are real, such that we even react emotionally to them. So those are wrong consciousnesses. Apparently there's some debate, I think, different scholars have different opinions about dreams, and some say they're conceptions, and some say they're mental perceptions. And once I had a discussion with Geshe-ma Kelsang Wangbo about wrong consciousnesses, and are they really so bad? Or can they be useful? And she agreed, oh yes, they can be useful. She said she's learned a lot by working with her anger, and so have I. You know, if you instead of just going along with your anger or whatever afflictions you have, if you look at them and you use antidotes and you understand them better, they can be incredibly useful. You can learn a lot about yourself and also about other people. And it can help you to help other people who are going through those afflictions, and also help you have more compassion for others who have those afflictions. So it depends on how we work with them, how we use them. They can be damaging or they can be beneficial. Also, in some of our practices, some of the practices that we do, for example, Tonglen, we imagine we're taking the suffering of others into ourselves. It destroys our self-cherishing attitude. That's completely gone. And then we send out all this light and everybody becomes happy. Some scholars, or some people, I don't know if they're actually scholars, but some people say, isn't that a wrong consciousness? It's not really happening. Are you shocked about that? I mean, we're imagining it. But yeah, there are meditations like that. There's another meditation, and it's used more in the, I think in the Theravada tradition, meditation on bones. Have you ever heard of that one? It's in the mindfulness, 4 foundations of mindfulness, where you imagine your body becoming like a skeleton, and then eventually everything becomes skeletons. There's nothing but skeletons and bones everywhere. It helps overcome attachment. That it does have a useful, something useful to it. But they do say that somebody who does that practice, and they do it really intensively, it can actually affect their perception. So even when they open their eyes, they still see bones. I'm not sure. I've never done that. I've never, had that experience, but they do say that. And then some people say, but isn't that a wrong consciousness? Seeing everything as bones? In a way it is, but Venerable, Geshe-la Kelsang Wangwa said, others would disagree and say, no, that's not a wrong consciousness, because we are deliberately cultivating these states of mind for a purpose, for a beneficial purpose, for our Dharma practice. So it wouldn't be right to call them wrong consciousnesses. But there is this element of wrongness there. But I guess as long as you're aware that you are deliberately cultivating those practices, and that there's a purpose for doing it, and it's not absolutely true 100%. Okay, last slide is showing the progression from wrong consciousness to realization. So now that we've had a brief look at these 7 types of knowing, although not all 7 of them are on this list, but some of them are. So some of these play a role in our spiritual practice, our spiritual development, to eventually reach liberation and enlightenment. So we start off with ignorance. We have this ignorance in our mind, and this is, I'm jumping back to prasangika rather than sutrantika. I'm pretending, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Ignorance. So we have ignorance that grasps things to be inherently existing, and this is a wrong conception. It's a wrong consciousness, a wrong conceptual consciousness. This has been in our mind from beginningless time, according to Buddhism. It didn't start somewhere. It wasn't that our mind was once free of that wrong consciousness and then suddenly it came in from somewhere. It's always been there. We've never been free of it. So this is kind of the bad news. But then, if we're fortunate to meet the Dharma and we hear teachings on emptiness, that things are empty of inherent existence. They don't exist inherently, independently from their own side. So then we might start to have doubt. Might have doubt. And we might go through all 3 levels of doubt. Initially we might think, well, especially if we have been educated in some system that teaches us that things are inherently existing, we might not want to give that up. So we think, yeah, I don't know. Buddha says they don't exist inherently, but I think they do. But then we may get more teachings, do more thinking and study, and then we might have equal doubt, maybe yes, maybe no, and then eventually doubt tending towards the fact. Yeah, maybe it's true. Maybe they are empty of inherent existence. The next step would be a correct assumption, a correctly assuming consciousness. So if we continue studying and thinking and meditating and get more convinced in emptiness, we may reach the point, or hopefully we will reach the point of having a correct assumption about it. So there we do believe in it. We do accept that things are definitely empty of inherent existence. But it's still flimsy, it's still weak, because we haven't gone through the process of using reasoning and actually realized it. But if we continue to study and meditate using correct reasons, such as dependent arising and diamond slivers and so on, there's these different reasonings. So we go through that process and continue working with our understanding of emptiness. Eventually, we'll have an inferential realization. So that's a very powerful state of mind. We have realized emptiness. It's still conceptual, not direct, but it's the only way we can get at emptiness. It's the only way we can realize emptiness before we have the direct perception. So we have to first realize it conceptually. And then, according to the Sutrantikas, the Sutra school, the first moment of that realization would be a valid cognizer, and then subsequent moments would be subsequent cognizers. So we have to continue to meditate, make ourselves familiar with emptiness, also bring in calm abiding, and eventually we will attain this yogic direct perception of emptiness. So that's the most correct state of mind that we can have as sentient beings, direct realization of emptiness. And that will shave off a big portion of our afflictions, not all of them. We still have to meditate more and more and more and accumulate merit, do more mandala offerings, and so on. And eventually we'll get rid of all our afflictions and all of our obscurations, cognitive obscurations, and our mind will become Buddha's mind. So hopefully that shows how it is helpful to know about these different states of mind. Some of them we already have, some of them we don't yet have, but we are working towards. We will get them one of these days. So there is this kind of step-by-step progression. And then I added this last slide with some books for those who would like to read more, study more about this topic. There's some books there. We have all of these in our library here. Others who wish to get them, you can try Amazon, you know that. They may not all be available on Amazon. The third one, which is called Reducing Suffering by Geshe Ngawang Pende, we have a copy of it in the library, but it seems to be published by just a very small publishing company. So it says if you want more copies, you have to write to this email address. But you could try Amazon, they may have it. The last book, I haven't read it yet. It's just come out last year. Was it last year? It's one of these big books. There's going to be a whole series of them. This is book number 2, volume 2, called The Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics. And so it's compiled by a whole team of scholars, Tibetan geshes. And it looks really interesting, but also really challenging. Yeah, it's like this big and small print, but yeah, it's got a lot of information there on the mind, and it looks like it's from different traditions, different schools of philosophy. And that's published by Wisdom. So for those adventurous ones who want to know more about the mind, those are some resources you can go to. We have about 5 minutes. If there's any last questions?
For inattentive perception, can it be during meditation when you are focused on the breath, but you still know there is pain or discomfort in the legs or body?
I never thought of that. Yeah, I think it's possible that during meditation there could be inattentive perception. I don't know about pain. I guess it depends on how you deal with the pain, but if there's a sound, for example, there's a sound and your mind is really absorbed in your meditation on emptiness or loving kindness or whatever, there's a sound but you're not fully attentive to it. So afterwards, if someone says, "What was that noise?" you would say, "Yeah, I heard a noise, but I don't know what it was." So it's possible. But with pain, I don't know. Can you be inattentive to pain?
From my own experience working in the forest, I think you can be. So you can be out doing, the tree thing, the limbing, lopping, and you come back and you see there's a gouge in your shin, and there's no recognition of that gouge happening.
Yeah. Yeah, they do talk about people pushing through pain. I mean, if you're jogging or you're running a marathon or something like that, there's probably pain and discomfort and your body's trying to say, "Stop, take a break, give me a break," or something like that, but you just keep pushing because you want to get to the end. Yeah, so maybe that's inattentive perception. I don't know. I have to explore that.
If I heard correctly, you said that Lama Tsongkhapa said all 5 sense perceptions can function at the one time, but only one fully realizes its object. Is that because, does that have anything to do with the mental consciousness relating to that one sense perception, or is it something about the sense consciousness in itself that only one can fully realize its object at one time? Like, I don't know, I was just like, why?
I guess it's just not possible for the mind to be fully attentive to 5 things at one moment. Multitasking. They say multitasking doesn't work very well. It's actually quite inefficient. Maybe it's a bit like that. No, I don't think it has to do with the mental consciousness. I don't think that has an effect on it. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. That's what Lama Tsongkhapa says, and I think, well, he probably knows what he's talking about. But yeah, I haven't thought about a reason. But just like I say, it's difficult to be fully attentive to 5 things at once and realize 5 things at once. I mean, like I say, it could be from one moment to the next. You could be attentive to something at one moment and attentive to, realize something one moment, realize something else the next moment. But in the very same moment, which is this very short period of time, to be fully attentive to 5 things. Maybe if you're an Arya, I mean, certainly Buddha would be able to do that. A Buddha's mind could do that, and maybe an Arya's mind could do that. But for us ordinary beings, probably just not possible.
The Dalai Lama said in one of the last talks he gave online that he will attain the state of end of suffering in this life. He's pretty confident about it. And I remember that some years ago he shared that experience of having a conceptual realization. So I wonder if he's now speaking from a yogic direct perception, and that he has the confidence now that further elimination of suffering is possible due to that state of mind.
I'm not sure. No, because if anyone were to say, "I have confidence that I will attain a true cessation," that's the words that I heard him say, true cessation in this life. So a true cessation occurs when you do have a yogic direct perception. So that means one hasn't yet attained a yogic direct perception of emptiness, but has attained an inferential realization of it. That's how I understand it. But there's confidence that if you continue meditating, that you will reach that yogic direct perception, and that's the first moment when you have a true cessation. Because true cessation, there's different kinds of true cessations. The ultimate true cessation is the state of nirvana, the state of an arhat. That's when you've totally eliminated all the afflictive emotions. But prior to that, you can have partial true cessations when you've eliminated a portion of the afflictions. That's still a true cessation, but you have to have many true cessations along the way, and then the big one, they're all gone completely. That's how I understand it. Yeah, it was pretty striking when he said that. With great confidence. Wow. Very inspiring. We can do it too. We just have to keep learning and practicing and meditating and creating merit and doing good deeds.